welcome Jonathan Visbal, the chairman of World Affairs.
Good evening. I'm glad you're all enjoying dinner and lots of conversation going on. And I wanted to thank you for attending the Global Philanthropy Forum conference that's taking place. At World Affairs, our mission is to explore issues and opportunities that transcend borders. And we strive to promote open, balanced discourse across sectors to better inform on timely matters of global importance. Throughout the past 2 days, we've learned about challenges young people face and the solutions that they bring. Here in the United States, school shootings have sadly become one of the dangers that young people face. There's something no person, no young person, no parent, no teacher should have to endure, not only in the United States, but anywhere in the world. Tonight we'll hear from a brave mother of a victim of Sandy Hook shooting. Her name is Nicole Hockley. In the face of this terrible loss, she's dedicated herself to preventing gun violence and advocates for innovative solutions. We'll also hear from a young survivor of the recent Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School shooting, David Hogg. In the wake of the tragedy, he and his peers led the Never Again movement, which mobilized students across the country to demand legislative action. And you see they've already been successful in the state of Florida. Joining our two speakers is Ray Suarez, who, along with co-host Jane Wales of our KQED show World Affairs, will be moderating tonight's panel discussion. I would also like to acknowledge my fellow trustee, Ambassador Jeff Bleich, who's in the audience. And Jeff, if you're here, you can stand up and say hi. Here's Jeff. Jeff's been an advocate for the ending of gun violence for over 20 years. I'm delighted that you're here, Jeff, and I know you wouldn't want to miss this conversation. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ray Suarez now, who will introduce our guests and bring them on stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good to be here. Nicole, there's your mic. The question posed by tonight's panel is, could it be that high school students will be a match for one of the most powerful lobbying groups in the country? When the students of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School began to mobilize in response to the shootings on Valentine's Day, they struck a chord, and their organizing was successful, I think, beyond a lot of people's wildest dreams as youth around the country mobilized to mark the day. They joined those who come before them, the students and parents of Sandy Hook Elementary School and Columbine, Virginia Tech, and many, many others. But they also reached out to those who were never touched by gun violence, never before put themselves in the shoes of the victims and their families. Young people who marched across the country were at times heroic, certainly persuasive, but also the recipients of a fusillade of backlash and invective and criticism and mockery and scorn. And that's part of this story, too. You know, we celebrate those kids who were marching in cities and towns across the country. And a lot of you may live in a world where you think, well, what could possibly be wrong with a teenager marching to stop gun violence? But if you look at the sum total of the American communications business, along with praise and admiration for the rapid mobilization of America's youth, came just the ugliest, most horrifying kind of messaging from other quarters of the society that questioned these young people's patriotism, questioned their seriousness, questioned even their standing as American citizens to be able to speak out on this issue. So it's a great pleasure to have these particular two panelists with me, Nicole Hockley, the founder and managing director of Sandy Hook Promise, and David Hogg, a student at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School and the co-founder of March for Our Lives. David joins us by Skype. Welcome. Good to have you with us.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
David, did anyone warn you what you were in for when the first terrible days after the shooting passed and your partners in the school, but also in a growing national network, started to figure out what your next moves were? Was there somebody who whispered in your ear, you better be ready for what's coming?
For a while, when I first started doing interviews, the first time that I remember really thinking about anything like that was when I was going along for an interview with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and the reporter looked at me and asked if I had had any death threats yet. And I hadn't really thought about that. It was about 3 days after the shooting at my school, where 17 people died. And that was when I started to realize this is getting real, and there are serious consequences to me standing up and my friends trying to speak out for our friends that no longer can. And I started to realize that now after, for example, what online conspiracy theorists had said about the Sandy Hook victims and their parents, we were soon about to become the next target of that, and we did.
You know, over the years, I've interviewed a lot of people who didn't ask for it, didn't go looking for it, but became the centers of national debates about the issues facing us as a country. When you stand in the eye of the hurricane, do you even hear all that stuff? Do you know what's being said about you? Do you hear some of the crazy messaging that's going out about who you and your friends are, what you're motivated by, what you want to accomplish?
Of course we hear what's going on, but in the center of that hurricane, there's a sense of calmness that we all have about us. We aren't doing this for anything else other than our friends that we've lost. We don't have jobs, we don't have titles to keep up anymore. We're doing this out of sheer emotion and working through the pain that we've all felt in our school and in our community now, and how we're fighting for those that no longer can. And we're fighting to save people that we will probably never meet, and we'll probably never know that they could have been touched by gun violence. But knowing that those people are going to be able to live long, successful, and healthy, happy lives with their kids and parents in the future is what makes it all worth it.
Can you live anything like a normal life right now? You're a high school student. You're figuring out what happens next. Is your life just of necessity not normal?
I don't think for anybody at our school it is normal. I don't think for me it's normal. And I don't think any of this should be normal, because it shouldn't be something that is acceptable or normal in society. I mean, tomorrow I have school, and then the next day I have prom. And I'm having to make the decision between going to prom and going to protest at the NRA convention in Dallas this coming Saturday, where both the president and vice president, who said they stood with us, and again, basically the NRA, are now showing that their wallets and their hearts are in the same place.
Well, you said you have to decide. Have you made that decision? Are you going to?
I've decided to be a normal high schooler for once, and live out my last few days of my high school career, just being a high schooler while I still can.
Nicole Hockley, it's been 5.5 years. Can you remember what it was like in those first days where you were figuring things out, where you and others were trying to figure out how best to respond to this terrifying tragedy?
Absolutely not. No, the first few days I didn't get out of bed, and I actually had lost the ability to speak. And I have a very Swiss cheese memory of the first several months, just dealing with the PTSD, as well as trying to understand the loss of my son, and helping my 8-year-old at the time, who was there the day of the tragedy and heard everything, helping him try to understand what he had done. So I took a week before I spoke out. And then I spoke out at Dylan's funeral, which was 1 week after the shooting. And I remember talking to a journalist, the very first time that I spoke to a journalist, and they said to me, right after the service for my son, who had just been cremated, he said, "So what do you think of Wayne LaPierre's statement today, that the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun?" And I looked at this journalist and I said, "Who's Wayne LaPierre?" Because I had no idea about the issue of gun violence. Unlike David and his peers, they grew up with the issue of gun violence. I didn't. I grew up not having any understanding of it. And then after I graduated college, I moved to England, where I lived for 18 years, where gun violence is not an issue, and moved back to Newtown in 2011. And less than 2 years later, my son was killed. So this has been a steep education curve for me. And though I don't remember those early days, I remember with exact clarity every moment and decision since then on this long fight. And I know what my path is ahead of me. And there is no ever returning to the life that I had before.
There are organizing groups, there are political efforts that have come out of many similar crimes. Whether it's Columbine, Virginia Tech, there are groups pushing on different parts of the issue. Mm-hmm. How did you design Sandy Hook Promise? How is it different from some of the others? And were there false starts as you refined what your model eventually would be?
There were a lot of false starts. We made a lot of mistakes in the early days, and fortunately we learned fast. My background is in marketing and communications, and my fellow MDs who helped start the organization also have business backgrounds. And when we started, we focused on policy because that was what you did. That was what all the other existing groups said that we should do, how we should use our voices. And not knowing anything, we jumped straight into that and fought hard for background checks. Visited about 49 senators in the case of in the short space of a few weeks, focusing on senators who were on the fence or who were against the issue. And, they cried in front of us. We didn't cry in front of them. They often said, yes, my constituents would like this. And then, I sat up in the gallery as they voted no. And that was a horrible day. And being in the Rose Garden with an incredibly angry president, that was a moment that we said, you know what, if something like background checks can't pass, which supposedly is the low-hanging fruit, which supposedly every poll says people want, and that NRA members want, and gun members want, if that can't pass, and we haven't really seen anything meaningful for about 3 decades prior to that on a policy perspective, then we're going about this in a very backwards way. So we started studying the issue from a very different perspective, and we studied social movements. We studied what are the levers that you need to pull to create change, because our country has taken polarized and divisive issues, everything from marriage equality back to civil rights, and we have found the common ground. We have found a way forward. And we realized that actually policy and politics, voting for the right person, is usually the last 2 levers that you pull. You need grassroots experience. You need education. You need programs. You think about designated driver. There's no policy called designated driver. It's a behavioral program that has saved hundreds of thousands of lives. What policy does is reinforce a behavior that you've already created. So to just focus on a top-down approach, that was a significant false start for us and reshaped our entire strategy as a result.
It's been 5.5 years since the shooting. Are there contrary impulses pushing on you and the other parents in the early days where you want to move quickly while the public is still engaged, while the issue is still hot, and at the same time you have to step carefully and deliberately because there are some people who want to use you, some people who want to exploit you, and some people who don't have, let's say, your own interests at heart, have interests of their own.
Oh yeah, for sure. Someone else trying to force their agenda on me is something I've experienced far too often. And I remember a very senior person in the early days looking directly at me and saying, "You don't know how to use your voice. You're not using your assets." And I said, "Excuse me, I am not an asset, and I know how to use my own voice. Thank you. I don't need you to tell me, because how's that been going for you and what you've been doing so far?" And that's what I love about the Parkland student leaders like David, because they also have kind of said to all the adults, get out of our way. Let us be authentic. Let us do this our way, because you guys haven't been doing such a great job. So give us the power and just amplify our voices. And that has really breathed a lot of new life into this movement. And it's accelerated the timeline for change, which is exciting.
David Hogg, same question. Is there a sort of middle ground that has to be found between moving quickly while there's still intense interest in the aftermath of the shooting, and not moving so quickly that you set a foot wrong, which may harm your credibility?
I think that there definitely is, but I think it's also important to realize that I think our policy platform is pretty middle ground. Mm-hmm. Right now we have 5 main points, and that's universal background checks, funding for ATF, funding for CDC research, because right now, they're legally not allowed to fund any gun violence research through the CDC. Our 3rd point is the digitalization of ATF firearm records. Our 4th is a ban on high-capacity magazines, and our 5th is a ban on assault weapons. It's pretty middle ground, and it shouldn't be that hard.
Well, you got a big hand. I don't know if you could hear it. Your agenda seems to be working in this room in Redwood City, California. Do you worry about flagging energy, flagging public interest, wandering attention? We're on the verge of what could be some of the blockbuster political headlines of the young century. Could you be chased off the front pages and even out of the inside pages of the paper by events that are far beyond your control or your ability to be heard above the din?
In a temporary, maybe. But the important thing to realize is, with these old politicians, we're the next generation, and we write our own history. I think Obama said it best, that we write our own history, and we have to realize that. That's where our power lies, and that's what we're going to do. Whether or not it's with these old politicians is up to them, and they need to realize that we're going to be writing these history books, and they'll be scared if they don't stand with the kids.
Nicole, now that the events are 5 years in the rearview mirror, how do you keep up the interest, the intensity, keep the people on task who are nominal allies in your struggle, but also have lives to lead and other things they have to do?
It's about giving experience in the community. That's the way to keep people engaged. And it's funny you mentioned rear view, because I still look in the rear view mirror of my car and I can still see Dylan sitting in his car seat there. And that is what personally drives me every day, honoring my son that died and protecting my son that survived. But it's about maintaining this drum beat. There are moments where that drum beat is heard that much louder, and you do have to take advantage of those and really work the media and work your base to engage more people and get them involved, but then it's about immediately giving them an experience. The one thing that I've learned from studying the NRA and the AARP is that those are 2 best-in-class organizers. And there's a lot of lessons that can be learned about how they develop deep relationships with their base, to the extent that some of them are prepared to go through the wall for them. And that's what we have not been so good at doing on the other side of gun violence prevention, and why we organize and give grassroots experience, give people something to say, I did that in my own community and I helped stop that tragedy. I helped get that person to the help they need. And it's also why we focus on 2 generations. It's why so much of our efforts is focused within schools, particularly middle and high schools, because that's where the change is going to come from.
Is there a necessity to make sure that there's consistency all the way down with allies? Or are you willing to make allies with whoever wants to work with you? I mean, March for Our Lives is now up and running. Do you have to agree on everything to work generally toward the same goal?
Absolutely not. A lot of people say, you know, how come, you know, Sandy Hook Promise and the other groups, why don't you all just join up, create one big group and go for it? A movement is not one person or one organization. A movement is different people with the same end goal, but taking their lane in the highway, talking to their own audience. We maintain a very strategically, a very nonpartisan, moderate position. We worked just as well with the Obama administration as we're currently working with the Trump administration. And sometimes that's hard, but you have to think about the greater good and what it is the end goal that you're trying to achieve, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who's sitting in the White House for this issue. People are dying regardless of their politics. This shouldn't have to be a political issue. It should be about what we need to do in that common ground area to make a difference. So we do work with unlikely allies. We have even talked about the NRA, and that's like, okay, yeah, I can't go there. So we don't go, though. I can't cross that moral fiber of my being. But to work with people who say, you know what, we might be on different sides of this issue, but we need to find common ground. Because if all I do is talk to people on the far left or the far right, we're not going to make progress. There are some people who are very, very good at tackling those issues, but there's a huge amount of people in the center who are just saying, I don't want to be involved in a fight. I just want to keep my kids safe. Those are the people that we're talking to and giving them the hope and the knowledge that this is not a helpless and hopeless issue, that there are things they can do to make a difference, and that builds the relationship, and that's how you move the needle.
David Hogg, just a moment ago you heard Nicole talking about just how good the NRA is at what it does. How do you guys expect to take them on, where so many others have failed in the past, and the things just being right isn't enough, apparently? If 62% of Americans approve enhanced background checks and it doesn't happen year after year, wanting it isn't enough, public opinion isn't enough, even having a lot of politicians on your side isn't enough. What's going to be enough?
Voting.
Yeah.
That's it. It's as simple as that, because these politicians are not going to listen to us so long as they're bought by the NRA, and so long as the difference between people that say that they want universal background checks and people that say that they don't when they go to these congressional meetings, is that these people that are the main constituents of the NRA go to their congressmen and speak to them whenever they are going to pass any form of gun legislation that doesn't infringe upon their Second Amendment rights, but because they think it will, because they think it's going to be this slippery slope, they automatically go to them and say, look, I'm not going to vote for you. As your constituent, I am asking you not to do this. And that's where we have the lacking. We don't have the backbone on the other side of this until now. Now is the time for change. And that's why we need everybody to go out and vote. And when there is a law that's coming up and we say, like on Twitter or our website or anywhere else, that we need you to call your congressman and write them letters and go to their office and say, I want you, for example, Speaker Paul Ryan, to allow a vote on universal background checks, we have to go to them and make our voices heard, because even though it may be the minority of people that don't want gun legislation that will save lives, the majority of people do. It's because they don't go out and become politically active that these things continue to happen. Now is our time to be the change we wish to see, that we have to see, to save all of these kids' lives and the future of America.
Yeah.
Just recently, The Nation dropped into my mailbox, and there's David Hogg and his Stoneman Douglas School comrades. The headline is "The Disruptors: How the Youth Activists of Never Again Are Upending Gun Politics." Is your age, David, a handicap or an advantage at this point in the game?
Definitely an advantage, because we don't have anything to lose. I don't have a job to lose. I don't have anything else other than I'm not getting paid. What I'm doing is I'm fighting for my friends, and that's the only form of payment that I could ever accept is sensible gun legislation that would have saved my friends' lives and will save lives in the future of those people that will never even know that they have the life that they have now because of the work that people like us put into place beforehand. I truly think in the future, when all of the kids that are in our movement right now have their own kids, they're going to look back and ask them in U.S. history how we lived through a time like this where this was acceptable for so long. And we're going to look back at them and say the reason why this happened is because people didn't have hope, they didn't vote, and they weren't politically active. And that's where we're asking every single person that we meet to become. Get out and vote, get registered, get educated, vote, and go to your congressman and your local and state legislators and talk to them about gun legislation before you have to have something like this happen to you before you become politically active.
How do you, Nicole, not surrender to cynicism when, I heard things like this said by some of the survivors of Virginia Tech who I interviewed after the shootings there. I interviewed teachers from Columbine High School who said similarly that America, once they see this, America will do something. And that was, 20 years ago?
Yeah, it's far too late. I will never become cynical about this because there's too much to lose. Before 1214, I was a ridiculously optimistic person, and I'm working hard to get that back. But the thing is, if you're cynical about this, then you're part of the problem. It's the apathy to this issue that is really killing so many. So when you think about disruption, you think about what David and his peers are doing in terms of disrupting youth. When you think about Sandy Hook Promise and taking a completely polarly opposite approach to the way this issue has ever been fought before, that's also a disruption technique. But I also know that it works, and that gives me the hope, because when I'm out at schools and I'm in front of students and I can almost see the light bulbs going off over their heads and knowing that they get it and they're going to make a difference. And then when I hear the reports back from schools saying your training has literally just stopped another school shooting threat, your training has just stopped this other suicide, your training has reduced bullying, your training has stopped cutting, we've gotten all these kids help, I know we're making a difference, and it's qualitative and it's quantitative. So we're putting evidence behind all of our programs. So I know we're saving lives every day, and I know we're educating people in very red states. We are creating a new base to get to the influential majority that's required for this movement to then reinforce and enforce policy change. So it's totally a matter of when, not if, and bringing youth into it and encouraging vote and encouraging voice, demanding vote and voice. Again, that just accelerates this. So I will never fall into the cynicism, because this is absolutely winnable, and I'm not here to fight, I'm just here to win, and that's what we're going to do.
Earlier in conversation, you told somebody as straightforwardly and as convincingly as you say your own name that you've already saved lots of lives. How do you know that? Because
schools tell us. So, for example, we trained a school last January in Ohio in safety assessment and intervention. 2 weeks later, they gave me a call and said, this just happened. Because of your training, we uncovered a substantive threat. We usually would suspend the student. We now know that that's the worst thing that you can possibly do. We kept them in. We dug deeper. We found plans. We found stockpiling of weapons. We found recruitment efforts. And instead of getting rid of that student, we kept them in. We kept them safe. We built the safety nets. Do I know that that definitely would have become a school shooting? No. But I know that there were plans and that this was intervened upon, and instead that child and their family got help. So it's quantitative in terms of our anonymous reporting system. I know when the threats come in. I know when someone says, I just saw this on social media, a school in Steel Canyon, after we trained them in Say Something and they became ambassadors for the program, there was a threat on Instagram to shoot up the school. Within an hour, over 300 students came forward and reported that threat. This is true results. Can I say that it absolutely would have happened? No. But I'd rather know that we stopped it from something that could have happened.
David, are you aware of all these other organizing activities? Do you go to school on them? Are there people advising you on what other people have tried and what's worked and what hasn't? Or are you just feeling your way along based on your own convictions about how to move ahead?
It's mainly just moving along on our own convictions about what's ahead. For us, I would say specifically right now, especially given that it's midterms that are coming up, we're a lot more policy focused. And being a debate kid, I always have been knowing about this stuff before even the tragic events at my school, which I think has really enabled me to be able to speak so much on these issues along with all my friends. It was part of the reason why we've been able to continue for so long. I think what Nicole was saying earlier about cynicism was important to remember, because we've lived through this, and it's not going to be cynicism that gets us out. It's going to be hope, hard work, and determination that eventually will, because we will get justice and we will save lives. We may never know the people of the lives that we save, but that's fine, because we will be able to see that in the numbers, and we'll be able to see that in the lives that people are able to continue having, because they weren't affected by gun violence. They weren't killed. And at this point, it's trying to prove that something didn't happen because of what we're doing. It's like trying to prove Bigfoot doesn't exist. But what we have to do is make sure that we fight for those that don't even know that this could be happening to them in the coming days or coming years. And focusing on the social outreach approach, like Sandy Hook Promise does, is one of the most important things, because I've been looking into a lot of the different approaches to this as well recently. For example, the ceasefire program in Chicago, where they've lowered in a couple neighborhoods there, the amount of people that have died as a result of gun violence by 100% in about a year. Mm-hmm. And taking the social approach on this is just one of the many aspects of how to approach it.
But when we're talking about where you're going or not going to college, when Emma Gonzalez is photoshopped into tearing up the Constitution, when we're talking about whether you're crisis actors or whether your father ever worked for the FBI, is that a sign of a culture trying to trivialize you, or a sign of a culture that's very frightened of what you've got to say and doesn't want you to succeed? Or maybe both.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what they try doing oftentimes is after these shootings, if anybody stands up, Nicole knows this even better than I do. I had a really good video on this on Vox about it. Basically, what they try doing is these online trolls from the very conservative side of America, the alt-right, will start coming out and start trying to smear us and making that the story, calling us crisis actors. And I think there's a certain power in that. Them calling us crisis actors keeps us in the news more, and we're able to spread our message for longer and keep our voices out there and our voices heard. And I think realizing that that inherent power is there, and not taking them seriously from what we've done with our movement. You look at all of our responses, none of them are serious, because why should they be? It's ridiculous. These things calling us crisis it's just really stupid at this point. And we need to get we just have to point out these people are trying to distract from the actual issue here, and they're trying to distract from what we're all fighting for at the same time, which is saving lives. Mm.
It may be stupid, but 5 years later, they're still saying about you and your families.
Oh, yeah, and David and I share that we've both been called lizard people, and that you can only, recognize us when you wear certain sunglasses. So, or that we're Illuminati, which my 13-year-old actually thinks is pretty cool. But I and Mark Barden, my partner at Sandy Hook Promise, we adopted a different approach. We couldn't see the humor. For a start, and also because we were very nervous for our children's lives, because David gets death threats. I've had 5 years worth of death threats, and that's hard to brush off. And at the end of the day, I don't care what happens to me, but if anyone ever came for my son, that would not be good. For us, we decided just ignore them, because once you feed the trolls, they multiply. But I love, David and Cameron's and Emma's approach in terms of laughing it off and just diffusing the situation with humor. That works for them. I couldn't do that myself. It's easier for me to ignore it and then try to shut people like Alex Jones down, which is what we're trying to do.
It sounds like that day is getting closer, actually.
Oh yeah, and that's going to be a good day. That's going to be, and I was talking to David a couple of weeks ago, and I said, it is kind of like whack-a-mole though, because you're going to get rid of one, and another one's going to pop up. But and he had said that in his Vox interview. But I think it's also, you have to ensure that people know that they can't just say whatever they want, and that there are penalties for spreading these lies. And whether he considers himself an entertainer or what, he is inciting violence. That has a real effect on real-life people who aren't protected. So yeah, that day is coming fast and furious.
You two are at two very different points on the timeline. Do you have any advice for David, or you just want to stand back and watch him do his thing?
Well, the mom in me wants me to tell him to get some sleep. Because I know that, 5 years in, I'm still not sleeping well, and he's as driven and as passionate as I was in the beginning and have struggled to maintain. But I was saying at my table, I'm 47, so I probably have another 20 of 30 years of this. David probably has another 50 or so years of this. So in terms of, if that's what he chooses to do. So in terms of self-care and sustainability, it's very important that the faces and voices and the drivers of the movement don't burn out.
So going to the prom is a good idea.
Yeah, go to the prom, have fun, be a kid for as long as, I mean kid in a very nice way, obviously, you're a young adult, but you're still a kid to me, so sorry. My son's only 5 years younger than you, but and also I said to David and one of his friends, I said, celebrate the successes. This is a hard movement, and it's easy to get discouraged because you will face a lot of failures, you'll face a lot of opposition, but in terms of that drumbeat of approach of what you need to take, you need to make time for success and then celebrate those successes, because that's also the way to keep you energized and refreshed, but also for your base, for your supporters. You need to make time for that so that you're then ready for the next battle.
Well, David, I want to look ahead a little bit with you before we close. One of the things that's attracted the most attention about March for Our Lives is that it was adamant about keeping student power front and center and keeping the focus on young people. Going forward, given that, grown-ups have most of the money, but they also, in some cases, have a lot of good advice and a lot of institutional heft and a lot of organizing experience, can you open the door a crack and still remain student-centered, student-focused, youth-focused, without letting them mob you up and take your eye off the ball?
I think that's an important question to ask, and I think that in moderation is key in this for our part of the movement, because we are the student leaders, and we are the future of this debate. Like it or not, we're the next generation, and I think one of the best examples of trying to remain front and center is we've had a couple of phone calls where people have offered us $500,000 before the march, we'll give you $500,000 if, and we immediately basically hung up on them and said no, because we aren't here to push anyone's agenda except our own to save what would have saved our friends' lives and what will save the future of America and these kids' lives. And I think it's important to definitely celebrate the successes, like Nicole's saying. If you look at my Twitter, one of the things I post a lot is the young people will win with what we've done so far. Since February 14th, we've had over 25 gun laws passed in 13 states. to help ensure the safety and security of these people, these kids, and these adults, so that nobody has to live through this again. In Florida, one of the most Republican states, we've raised the age to buy a firearm to 21, but that's only for public sales, but still it's a good movement and a big step forward. We've also tried to increase from school safety and attacking this, like Nicole said, from all sides, because that's what this is going to have to be. I like to use a metaphor of kind of like a balloon that we're all trying to push on at the same time. And once there's enough of us pushing on it and from all directions, it's going to pop. And what will be left is us and our policies, and we'll win.
Before we close, Nicole, I want to make sure people remember what this is all about, what's at the base of this conversation. And that's children like your son, children like David's schoolmates. You have some photos for us.
Yeah, so that's Dee. That's Dylan, taken about a year before he was killed. And he was my youngest and he was my everything. He was autistic, so I spent a lot more time with him, trying to understand him and help him reach his potential. And he died in the arms of his special education assistant, who also died while trying to protect him. And, I visited the spot in the classroom where he was taken, and hoping that perhaps I'd feel him there, but obviously he wasn't there, but he's still all around me. And there's another picture that was taken a few months before on our front lawn. And I look at that photo of Jake, who's now 13, and Dylan, who is forever 6, and that's how life should be.
Nicole Hockley is the founder and managing director of Sandy Hook Promise, and David Hogg is one of the founders of March for Our Lives. Great to have you both with us. Thanks a lot for telling us your story. Good luck. David, I figure you can't see it, but you just got a standing ovation. So good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you.